This is Religious Studies 3396. Everybody in the right place? The Bible and Modern Science. Welcome to this course. This is my first experience in teaching this kind of course, and it's been a doozy to try to get prepared for. I hope that you're ready to do some thinking and to do some reading. As you've looked at the reading assignments, I hope it hadn't scared you. Actually, I had picked out about 3 or 4 times as many books to have for this course, but I was wisely talked out of having that many. But you need to understand that these books that you're assigned and the readings that you're assigned are primarily background readings. A great deal of what we do in this course will depend upon your being at class and paying special attention in your class to what I say, because I'll be talking about the main themes from your reading that you'll be responsible for in terms of grading. This reading looks formidable, but what it means is that I've just simply provided a great deal of backup material for you so that you can get into this subject just about as fast and as deeply as you would like to. And probably the best way to do your reading is to read as much as you can before the class, and then after we've discussed these things in class, you'll be able to think about them, and think about them in terms of maybe some of the reading that you haven't done. And so the reading itself is very supplementary, but it's going to be very helpful for you, as much of it as you can get into. I'm Lynn Mitchell. I have been at the University of Houston since 1985. I began the Religious Studies program at the University of Houston at the invitation of Dean Pickering, who was Dean of the Humanities at the time. I had been teaching at the University of St. Thomas for 11 years before that as professor of theology. But my degree was from Rice in religious studies, and I came to Rice in '69 to do that degree. And the primary purpose for that degree is to teach religious studies in a state or public university. And so I was invited in 1981 to be the first visiting scholar in religion at the university, and took that opportunity to get very interested in the University of Houston, and in conversation with Dean Pickering and some other people, it was determined that it was about time to get started again on a religious studies program at the University of Houston. In its beginning, the University of Houston had a religious studies department when it was a community college. But when it became a state university, that was kind of rolled into the philosophy department, and you know what happens when that happens. It just kind of got swallowed whole and disappeared. So there have been a lot of people who have wanted to bring religious studies back to the university, and we've been working on it now for quite a few years. And we now have a minor. For years we had courses that were cultural heritage core curriculum courses. And then we established a minor a few years ago. And that minor includes courses taught by me and by Professor Wishegrod, who are the full-time religious studies professors, but also taught by visiting scholars in various areas and by people in other disciplines. So it's an interdisciplinary minor. If you're interested in the minor, just get in touch with me and I'll sign you up. I'm not going to tell you very much about my own personal beliefs, because one of the problems in this course is that it is an extremely, what we're dealing with are extremely volatile issues. And one of the things that religious studies tries to do is it tries to approach whatever subject you're dealing with in as objective a manner as possible. Now, you know and I know, if you're educated, that objectivity is a very hard thing to come by. So I prefer simply to say that we're going to try to approach it as fairly as possible. And in the light of that, I've chosen several textbooks from very far extremes in approaching this subject, all the way from a scholar named Morris, who's a graduate of Rice University, but he's the most important creation scientist in terms of his impact on American culture and media and education. And he believes in what is called creation science, and therefore, from his perspective, the Bible is science. So when you're reading Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you're actually reading science long before modern science developed. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, I have a book by Jay Gould, whose position is that science and religion have nothing in common in terms of methodology, and that therefore, if you want to have religion, he thinks it's all right, but if you want to have religion, you should at least keep it completely and totally separate in intellectual discussions from any scientific study or scientific methodology. Now, that's not really the opposite extreme. You can get farther extreme that is farther to the left than that, and it's just like in political philosophy where communism and fascism kind of meet. That is, there are fundamentalist naturalists, just like there are fundamentalist Christians. And fundamentalist naturalists believe that Genesis 1 and 2 are attempts at scientific discussion. They're just failed attempts. And so they have no relevance whatever in the modern discussion. And as you might guess, I fall somewhere in between those two very wide extremes. But as we go along, I hope you will help bring the discussion along. Let's look at a definition of a course, or a description of a course that I've been teaching here for a long time, and that's a course which I entitled The Bible and Western Culture. That was the primary course with which I started, and I've had by now thousands of students in this course, and this is the description of it that I gave 16 years ago. I'd already been teaching basically the same course before. But it simply says that this course is studying the Bible as a primary document of Western culture. Now, I could have said the primary document of Western culture, but that probably would have been stretching it a little bit. But I certainly wanted to say, to help us understand, that the Bible is a primary document of Western culture, not a secondary one. And that without a study of the Bible, it's really very difficult to consider yourself to be an educated person or to have mastered almost any discipline in Western education. Because without the Bible, you can't understand the literary, the philosophical, and even the scientific underpinnings of Western culture. Now that comes as a surprise to people because we've developed in the United States, just over recent decades, a rather odd conception of what we call the separation of church and state. First of all, the expression separation of church and state is not found in the Constitution. That's an expression that Thomas Jefferson used in writing a letter to Baptists in appreciation for the Baptist support of the separation of church and state. But the separation of church and state these days has come almost to mean that we want to keep any discussion of religion separate from the public square, from public, especially from universities. And that, of course, is a different thing from separation of church and state. It's certainly a different thing from what the First Amendment is envisioning, trying to prohibit. The First Amendment wants to prohibit the establishment of religion. Therefore, its primary purpose is to preserve or to protect religion from the state, and at the same time, of course, that means that the state and its policies will be protected from any undue influence by religious establishments of any kind. But it is really very difficult to separate religion from culture. So it doesn't make any difference whether a person is a fundamentalist religious person or a fundamentalist non-religious person. In order to be educated, you need to know about the Bible. Now, this course is called The Bible in Modern Science. There's another course in the university called Religion and Science, or Science and Religion. And that's taught by my friend Bill Austin, and that's a good course to get into if you want to deal more with the philosophical side of the question. We're going to deal with the philosophical side because this is primarily a course in the history of ideas. That's the reason why your readings are not so important in terms of gathering a bunch of dates and facts and so forth, but just to kind of get a feel for the history of ideas as modern science has developed in Western culture, out of medieval culture, out of the Christian consensus. And I first learned most of that from Bill Austin, because he was a professor of philosophy at Rice when I did my doctorate, and so some of my work was done under him. But I've been interested in the subject since I was a very small child. My family were migrant workers, and we spent a great deal of time, when we weren't working, we spent a great deal of time associated with the church. So my whole life, in terms of my education, had to do with work and with the church. And public school was kind of a total mishap for me, and I really didn't get down to real academic study until I started into college. And I've done pretty well at that since then. But when I was a child, the issue of science and religion was a very important one, because this was not too long after the Scopes monkey trial. I don't look that old, but it was just 15 years after the Scopes monkey trial that I was born. And so in our churches, which were largely what today would be called fundamentalists, but I really reject that term, because these people weren't fundamentalist in the sense of being just hard-nosed and ignorant and so forth. They were fundamentalist in the sense of being fairly conservative in terms of their understanding of the Bible and social understanding and so forth. And so as I got my education, which, as I said, I didn't get in public schools, but I did get it by my own reading, the question of the relationship of the Bible, which was very important to us, and science, which was also very important to me. I wanted, when I was a younger man, to become a scientist, and unfortunately, I didn't have a teacher in the whole public school system that could point me in that direction. But I was still very interested in the subject. But I also had a Sunday school teacher when I was 10 or 12 years old who tried to explain to us the relationship between science and the Bible. And his explanation was as follows. There really never existed anything of these animals that we call dinosaurs. They never really existed. Now, they have found some bones in various places. But if you're a good Christian from his perspective, you should understand that those bones were either created by God to test your faith, or they were created by the devil to destroy your faith. Well, I was, as I say, 10 or 12 years old, but even then I thought, well, give me a break. I didn't say, well, give me a break, because those weren't words used at the time, and I was a pretty foul-mouthed 12-year-old, so I'm not going to tell you what I said. But I really was unhappy about getting that kind of response in my Sunday school class about how the Bible is be related to science, and I never accepted anything like that as acceptable or as adequate to anything. So I've been interested in it all my life, and as I've gone through school, a great deal of what I've read has been pointing to that. And so when I was at Rice University under Bill Austin, my thought was focused on this subject, and even though it wasn't the subject of my dissertation, it's been one of my main interests ever since. The Bible is the primary document of Western culture, not just for religions, but for understanding the literary, the cultural, the historical, the scientific context of Western culture. And the scientific one, as I say, is the one that surprises people, because there is a myth, there's a very prevalent myth in American education and American intellectual circles, that at some time in the past there was this huge battle between the Bible and science, or between religion and science. And what happened, according to this myth, legend, is that the church was just going along famously suppressing any kind of scientific advanced or new knowledge and so forth, until some very courageous people came along, and I'm not doubting their courage, I'm just doubting the way this myth is put. People like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, and they had the strength and the courage to fight against religious thought and theology, and to establish modern science on a totally secular ground. And it's for that reason that science was able then to blossom, because the authority of the church had been overcome and the authority of theology had been overcome. So science was able to blossom then and to become the great secular religion of our modern world. The problem with that story is that it didn't ever happen. It didn't happen. Ain't never happened, however you want to put it. There was no such battle between science and religion. Medieval universities were established primarily to study theology. Theology was the queen of the sciences. All the word science means, of course, is knowledge in Latin. Theology was the queen of the sciences. And so anyone who went to a university in medieval times studied science. He studied just about all the science that was available for him to study. Now, obviously, nobody can do that anymore. Nobody can go to a university and study all the science that's available for him to study, because the movement, the scientific movement that was begun by Copernicus and Galileo and Newton, carried on by Newton and other people, has been obviously one of the most important movements in the history of human beings. And it would have been, and it was, fruitless and actually self-destructive for some religious people to get in the way of this scientific movement. But one of the things I want to deal with in this course is that it's not only fruitless and self-destructive, but it's really totally absurd for religious people to get in the way of it, because modern science originally belonged to religious people. All of the people who were the revolutionaries of modern science were religious people. In fact, Copernicus and Galileo were Catholic theologians, and some of the best writing on the relationship between the Bible and science, on how to interpret the Bible in the light of recent scientific discoveries, comes from Galileo, and we're going to be reading some of his work on that. Copernicus was a theologian. He was a priest. Newton was not a priest, and he was not Roman Catholic, but he considered his work to be theological, including his scientific work. He believed, which most theologians today do not believe, that he could prove the existence of God through science. And so all of his scientific work was done, as he said, to the greater glory of God. He also dabbled in a little alchemy, as did some of the other of the greatest scientists during this period. But he also wrote extensively biblical commentaries. I have his commentary on the book of Revelation in Latin. And a lot of that has not been translated because it's just been assumed that that was just a little part of his life that has no meaning for modern educated people. But it certainly had a great deal of meaning for him. And it was very important for Copernicus, it was very important for Galileo not to be perceived as in some way in conflict with his faith. He had problems with some of the members of his church, but as far as we know, he had no ultimate intellectual or theological problems with his faith. And he attempted a number of times to try to explain to people who didn't know much about what he was doing, how that what he had done was not in conflict with anything that the faith proclaimed. And in making that case, he quoted Augustine and all of the important theologians back to Augustine. He didn't quote Paul or anybody in the Old and the New Testament, because one of the problems we're going to see as we go into this course is that the Bible contains no science. And it's only after Christianity moved into Europe, where some of this pre-scientific activity was already going on, that Christian theologians even got involved in trying to show the compatibility of Christian faith and Jewish faith to science. But when they did get involved in it, they were very cautious people. They were much more cautious than a lot of Christians have been in the 20th century about how to relate science to the Bible. And they had a much more, well, this is a judgment, but I'll just state it and try to show it. They had a much more profound understanding of what the Bible was and what the Bible was supposed to be and what it was supposed to say. And so they realized in the first early centuries of this Christian era that the Bible was not a scientific book, and that the attempt to use biblical phrases and biblical ideas out of context to fight science just puts you in a bad situation, because, as some of the later Christian theologians pointed out, some of the best scientists in the world at the time were Muslims. And if you want to go around, we're talking after Augustine, but some of the best scientists in the world were Muslims. And so if you want to go around using the Bible to try to deny the discoveries of your own eyes and of scientific empirical method, then you're not doing the Christian faith a favor. And that may be a good lesson for us to deal with here in the 20th century, when every week you will have articles in the Houston Chronicle on this problem of the relationship between science and the Bible. Just this last week there was one in the Houston Chronicle. According to a March poll conducted by People for the American Way, 83% of Americans believe evolution should be taught in the schools. That was the primary result that the People for the American Way wanted, because of course they're fighting for the preservation of the teaching of evolution in public schools. They may not have wanted this result, but this is still an important result. A majority of people also think that creationism should be taught. And by creationism, they mean the view that the Bible is a scientific account of the origins. Now, one of the problems we're going to see in all of this discussion is the problem of language. I'm going to talk for a little bit before we quit today about what the Bible is. But one of the problems we have is the problem of language. I've done speeches in the last year before various groups, including, for instance, the American Jewish Congress, in which I made a statement which to me is just an obvious statement. But people have been so traumatized by this discussion, it really offended some people that were listening to me. The statement I made was, I was trying to show that scientific creationism is not considered to be a proper interpretation of Genesis by most Bible scholars and most theologians. That doesn't mean it's not true. I'm just saying that it's not generally considered to be a proper interpretation. That is, most scholars and theologians long ago understood the Bible as a different kind of literature from modern science, and therefore we shouldn't look into the Bible for modern scientific literature. But I was making the point, a very simple one, that there's a difference between claiming to believe in creation science, as that word has come to be known, and creation. Now, one of the problems is in the media, that distinction is almost never made. Where's that thing again? Evolution. Well, this says evolution versus creationism. But even creationism is misused if it is used as the opposite of evolution. There is a sense in which anyone who believes in God is a creationist. That is, if he believes in God in any way that is compatible with the ancient Jewish or Christian understanding of God. But when I made that statement at this particular place, a lot of people reacted almost as though they were offended because I was telling them that they had to believe in creation. Well, I was just assuming that they were Jews, that they were people who did believe in God. And if you believe in God in the Jewish and Christian sense, then you believe in creation. But because you believe that that God is the source of everything. And that God has something to do with everything. And that's all creation means. Creation, in other words, is a Christian theological doctrine. It is not a scientific doctrine. And people believed in creation long before any scientific doctrine of human origins or the origins of the world developed. And people believe in creation in spite of the fact that they also accept modern doctrines of the origins of human beings and the origins of the universe. And so just the language problem is going to be a problem, because in the media, now we have some good media people in religion in Houston, and they're getting better people in religion in some of the national media. ABC News, for instance, has a very good religion editor now, and Newsweek magazine has a very good religion editor. So if you read any articles on religion in Newsweek, you're going to get a pretty fair description of religion. One that is not evangelistic, but also one that is not just emotionally or psychologically anti-religious. And that's what I try to avoid in doing religious studies courses. Let me stop right now and see if somebody wants to fire up a question. I know that I've been just kind of rattling off like a shotgun, but I did want to give you some feel of some of the kinds of things we're going to be doing. Yes? Okay.
Well, my question was, I was looking at the listed textbooks and I noticed that one of the required texts is not the Bible. So,
well, the Bible is assumed to be something that you have available to you. I'm not requiring a particular text, a particular Bible. Any standard Bible will do. I personally use Bibles like the New Revised Standard Version or the Revised Standard Version. But there are other Bibles that are equally as good, and they all say the same thing. In modern biblical translation, you don't have any fights between Christian denominations anymore. You have fights sometimes among scholars as to how a verse should be translated, but that's not really a denominational fight. Sometimes the Catholics will fight with each other about how something will be translated and so forth. But if you get a standard Bible, like the New Revised Standard, the Revised Standard, the New International Bible is one that evangelicals use quite a bit, and it's a good translation. The Roman Catholics use the New American Bible, or the Jerusalem Bible, the New Jerusalem Bible, and all of those say the same thing. When I'm not a Roman Catholic, but when I taught at University of St. Thomas, I used the Catholic Bible because it said the same thing, and people were comfortable with it. There are some differences in the canon, that is, in the list of books that are found in the Old Testament in these Bibles. But scholars, Protestant, Catholic, or otherwise, still study these books that are not in their own canon. And so there's really much less animosity these days among Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox and Jews, among scholars, than there is among the lay people in their still in their communities. So just any good standard Bible. What I mean by standard Bible is one that is translated by a large group of scholars. In other words, it's a major project. There are a lot of Bibles that are just translated by one person. And there's nothing wrong with them if you understand what they are. But sometimes these can be very idiosyncratic. And so you may be misled as to what most scholars think a particular passage says. So anyway, just the assumption is that you will have access to a Bible. An idiosyncratic translation, for instance, a few years ago, a Bible was put out called the Living Bible. And it's a very good Bible if you want to give a Bible to children, younger children, because it's not a literal translation. It's a equivalency translation. So it translates in language that people can understand, and more Bibles are doing that too, while at the same time remaining true to the text. But in the Living Bible, for instance, in John chapter 1, verse 1, it translates it, "In the beginning was Jesus Christ." Well, that is not a translation. Not only is it not a translation, it is misleading, because the text says, "In the beginning was the Logos," or the Word. And you may eventually end up believing that Jesus is the Logos, but that's not a translation of that passage. You have to have the words translated properly, adequately, in order to try to understand what the author's trying to say. But most standard translations avoid that. Any other question?
You mentioned creation and then creation science being different. What are the differences with that?
Well, to state it simply, I said that anyone who believes in God, whether they're fundamentalist or liberal, believe in creation. That is, they believe that ultimately we owe our being and our existence to God. And whatever salvation and redemption and whatever future we have, we owe to God. That's just kind of the religious perspective of theism. And so it's hard to be a theist if you don't believe in creation. But it is not hard to be a theist and not believe in scientific creationism, which is the belief that Genesis 1 should be accepted as a literal, historical, scientific account of the origins of the world. Now, years ago, and that's actually what Charles Darwin meant by special creation. Darwin was a creationist. Until the latter years of his life, he started wondering whether there was a God or a creation. But when he wrote The Origin of the Species, he was a creationist. He believed that somehow or another everything owes its existence to God. But he denied what he called special creation. That is, the ordinary view, the common view, that Genesis 1 and 2 are actually scientific historical documents, and that therefore they're describing literally how God created the world. And so a great many people at that time believed that the world was created in 6 literal 24-hour days with a Sabbath day tacked on at the end, and that any other belief is a denial of the truth of the Bible. Well, see, that word truth is a little iffy here when we talk about truth. because a great many people, especially Americans have a harder time reading symbolic literature than just about anybody in history. Medieval people were much better at reading symbolic literature. But Americans, when Americans read literature, they want it to be literal historical. Every once in a while they'll move over into novels or science fiction and things like that. But usually they lean toward wanting something literal historical. And if they believe that the Bible is a revelation of God, they believe that God would want everything to be literal historical in His revelation, which is a very odd assumption if you understand that most of the Bible is poetry and symbolic literature. But on issues like this, where people believe that the meaning of the nature of human beings and the meaning and the nature of Christ and the meaning and the nature of salvation is at stake, they tend to want these passages to be very literal. And that position was not hard to hold in the second generation of scientific creationists. Because the second generation of scientific creationists, those that surround the Scopes monkey trial, which we'll talk about later on, were people who not only rejected science, but because they rejected science, they also rejected education in general. And so they assumed that education had to be something that was accomplished by their religious community, or it wasn't of any value, whatever. They didn't become as extreme in this regard, say, as the Amish and other kind of Anabaptists. But they did still leave all of their, even their denominational seminaries. They deserted their denominational seminaries and so forth, because the seminaries, some of them started saying, well, you don't want to go to the cemetery because then you'll lose your faith. And so they began to establish their own little schools and own little Bible schools and so forth. And one of the primary purposes for establishing these schools was to keep any threatening scientific theories at bay. And these were not unintelligent people. And some of them were fairly educated people. The Proto Fundamentalists, that is the fundamentalists, the people who considered themselves to be fundamentalists in the latter part of the 19th century, were highly educated people. Some of them were at Princeton University and so forth. They didn't have near as much problem with, say, the scientific theory of evolution as some of their parishioners did. But they did have a problem with naturalism. That is, the belief that everything arises out of nature with no reference to God. In other words, they were fighting a philosophical, theological battle. They weren't really fighting a scientific battle. But it eventually turned into a scientific battle. And people assumed that scientists were just leading us astray by insisting on theories and hypotheses that not only did not have any scientific evidence behind them, but were intentionally devised by people who did not believe in God and therefore had to have some other explanation. And there were some scientists like that. Fred Hoyle was kind of like that. He didn't believe in God, and so that's the reason why he insisted on the steady state theory even beyond the evidence for the Big Bang theory, because the steady state theory, you don't even need to think about God. Of course, he misunderstood theology himself, because Thomas Aquinas, for instance, could have had a steady state theory and still had a belief in God. But a lot of the discussion going on in the 20th century has been the least educated discussion on the relation between science and religion. And the place where this early lay scientific creationism has fallen apart primarily is the problem with time, the age of the earth. Because there were some creationists, even some scientific creationists in the 19th century, who had already decided that the earth was much older than the traditional interpretation of the Bible. But 20th century scientific creationists went back to the theory that the earth is very young, and there are still some very strong young earth creationists, and they consider old earth creationists to be too liberal to have much fellowship with. So a lot of the discussion and the debate going on about science and religion now are going on among evangelicals, among people who used to be called fundamentalists. And a lot of people don't know about that discussion. They think the discussion is just between fundamentalists and Jay Gould. But that's just one of a large spectrum of discussion going on. And many fundamentalists now who were New Age creationists just a few years ago are now Old Age creationists, Old Earth creationists. That is, they believe that the universe is 15 billion years old, but that God still created it, and that He created human beings in a special act, because human beings kind of stand out in their theology as being necessary for this to be a special act, so they can have a soul. And we'll talk about that problem later on, because this concept of the soul is actually not the traditional Christian concept of the soul. And so people who worry about whether an evolved human being has a soul or not are generally conservative Catholics or fundamentalist Protestants. Most other scholars don't worry about that question because they have a different understanding of what the soul is. But all of these little distinguishments don't get any play in the discussion. But we're going to be looking at a lot of these different ways of approaching it. And I hope what you're getting from this first class is that if you ask the question of a person on the street, you really don't have any idea what question they're answering, because when they think creationism, they may think the earth is 6,000 years old. When they think creationism, they may think that the universe is 15 billion years old. When they think creationism, they may think instantaneous creation just a few thousand years ago, or they may think a long period of development. And that's just among scientific creationists. When you get past scientific creationism, that is into more theologians of the of the European evangelical church and so forth, and they've already dealt with this question a long time ago, and what they're now trying to do is to understand how, say, a theory like the Big Bang or a theory like evolution can be compatible with the Bible and with Christian faith. Some of them are even trying to integrate these two ideas. And when you integrate these two ideas, you usually come up with a kind of a revision of theism, which we call panentheism, which we'll talk about more later on. But most scholars, including scholars that are Roman Catholic and Protestant evangelical, are tired of this fight. They're tireder of it than Jay Gould is, and so they're trying to get the word out that Christianity is not anti-scientific. There are some new religions developing in America that are very anti-scientific, under the headings of New Age and other kinds of things. But the most scientific traditional religion should be Judaism and Christianity, because it's out of these religions that modern science developed. Any other questions? Let me show you one of the kinds of issues that that I'm going to put out there, not as red meat. That's for the presidential candidate, vice presidential candidate to do, throw out red meat. But I'm going to throw out some things like this as red meat. Here is a quote from Carl Sagan. And do any of you know, do all of you know Carl Sagan? Carl Sagan was a very bright scientific popularizer who just died, what was it, last year or year before? And he wrote one book that was actually a script for a television series called Cosmos. And that course was taught here at the University of Houston for credit. And if you ever get a chance to see it, you need to see it because it's a brilliant, popular explanation of a great many scientific ideas. And I kind of like Carl. But it bothered me that Carl was not viewed critically by some of his students, because besides being a scientific popularizer, he was a naturalistic popularizer. That is, he left a little leeway for there being something beyond nature, but not much. And even what seemed to be beyond nature, he thought was still a part of nature. And so he began his book. This is the first sentence. The cosmos is all that there is, or ever was, or ever will be. Now, I want that sentence to be in your notes because I want you to think about it. First thing I want you to think about is this a scientific statement? I think deep down, Carl Sagan knew it wasn't a scientific statement, but he never told anybody. Is this a scientific statement? If it's not a scientific statement, what kind of a statement is it? How could it be reworded to be a scientific statement? Now, I'm not going to give you all the answers to those. We're going to talk about them as we go along, but just use that one sentence as a kind of a starting point for thinking about all of the things we're going to be thinking about. Is that a scientific statement? If it's not, what kind of a statement is it? And how could it be reworded to be a scientific statement? Now, there's another statement which also figures very strongly in this discussion, and that's the first verse of the first chapter of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, is that a scientific statement? If it's not a scientific statement, what kind of statement is it? Can it be made into a scientific statement? Well, these are complicated questions. They're not just obvious. Because if you're talking about the creation of the heavens and the earth, there is some kind of cross-reference there to nature, and therefore to science. But you can there can be a path that dissects some subject without turning it necessarily into a scientific statement. And if it's not a scientific statement, then how can it be analyzed? How can it be warranted? How can it be justified as a statement? Well, we're going to have to get some idea of what the Bible is in order to understand what relationship that might have to science. If you look at your course objectives, and we'll put those up on the on the screen as well. The course objectives are really very simple to state, but extremely complex. This discussion that's now going on is the most intense discussion of this subject ever had in history. There are more books being written on this subject from all different perspectives now than there have been in history, certainly more than there were 10, 20 years ago. What is the course objectives are to understand how the Bible has influenced the development of science, to understand how science has influenced biblical interpretation, and to critically examine contemporary theories on the relationship between the Bible and science. To understand how the Bible has influenced the development of science. A lot of people are not aware that there's been any influence of the Bible on the development of science except negative influence. According to this view, all the Bible has ever done has been a roadblock to the development of science. But that is a view which is not held by many academic scholars, history of ideas scholars, at all. In fact, they hold basically the opposite, and that is that you cannot understand the development or the rise of science without understanding its biblical precedents, however you understand those. To understand how science has been influenced by biblical interpretation, or science has influenced biblical interpretation, is also important, because some people's view of the Bible is that it's just kind of a static piece of holy literature that's been dropped out of heaven, and it just has one interpretation and one only, and it doesn't make any difference how our understanding of the world changes, or how our understanding of language changes, or how our understanding of history changes. It's going to be interpreted exactly the same way. There were some people who argued with Galileo in that way, and they lost. I mean, they just lost. There's no way for people to argue that way and not lose. For instance, in the book of Joshua, where it says that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, if you don't understand what kind of literature the Bible is and how such a passage should be read, then you're going to lose in a fight with the scientists. There's just no way you can win that fight. And in the same way, and this is more controversial, and you may want to argue with me about it, in the same way, to argue that because a lot of good Christian people have believed that the earth was only 6,000 years old, that in order to be a Christian you have to believe that. From my perspective, you're going to lose that battle. And even most fundamentalist evangelical Christian scholars have come to that conclusion and have backed off that. But in many ways they still haven't backed off from some other things on which they're going to lose. So to critically examine contemporary theories on the relation between the Bible and science will kind of sum up what the course is. We need to spend some time on what is the Bible, just introducing that subject, and that will be, of course, a theme all the way through. Nothing that we've said today is going to end our discussion of what we've talked about. What is the Bible? Well, there are a lot of words that come into play when we talk about Bible. One of those words, and a very important one, is the word revelation. It's hard to conceive of the Bible being of any significance, enduring significance, unless there is not some concept of revelation that attaches to it. But the problem is, revelation has been just as difficult a problem to try to define as any other. And quite often people just assume they know what revelation means. And so the debate gets hung up again on a word. What is the relationship of the Bible to our own subjectivity? to fact. What is a fact? Fact used to be fairly easily defined. Locke made a great deal of believing facts. Even in his theology, Locke was a theologian also. In fact, a great deal of his writing was theology. But again, in our modern assumption that theology is of no value, a lot of Locke's theological writings are not paid any attention to. But this is one of his important, one of the important things he dealt with in his theology was fact. And he argued that things like the death and the resurrection of Christ were facts. Well, obviously he means something different by that than what a scientist means by a fact. And sometimes those differences are not put out on the table and discussed. For Locke, something was a fact that happened. The miraculous nature of it is irrelevant. If it happened, it was a fact. And he believed that the resurrection happened. On the other hand, and that's the basis upon which a lot of fundamentalist scientists have used the word fact. And that's also a problem when we talk about what a theory is, because creation scientists mean something different by theory than, say, Jay Gould or another scientist might mean by it. And also related to our problem of what is the Bible is what is the relationship between the Bible and philosophy, and what is the relationship between the Bible and our worldview or our perspective. One of the things we're going to have to look at is the relationship between the Bible and philosophy, because a lot of people use the word philosophy in a very loose sense, in saying, for instance, that Judaism and Christianity are philosophies of life. Well, are there philosophies? Well, there is a sense, obviously, in which Judaism and Christianity are philosophies of life, but that really confuses the issue when we classify them as philosophical faiths, because they're not philosophical faiths. If you want a philosophical faith, you have to go to Plato or to Plotinus or to Aristotle. And there were no non-religious philosophies until very recently. So if you study Plato, you're studying a religious philosophy. If you study Aristotle, you're studying a religious. If you study Hegel, you're studying a religious philosophy. But Judaism and Christianity are biblical faiths, and the Bible is not a book of philosophy. The Bible obviously touches on some of the same things that philosophy touches on, but it's not a book of philosophy. And therefore, it was a hard job when Christianity and Judaism moved into Europe to integrate philosophical thought and biblical thought. Some people thought that, in fact, it was an anti-Christian thing to do, to try to integrate philosophical thought with biblical thought, because they thought that that immediately when you integrate them, or when you synthesize them, you distort the biblical worldview so badly that you might as well have just kept the pagan ideas and not brought the Bible into the subject. And so there were some people who just said, we shouldn't do this at all. We should just proclaim the Bible, just throw it out there, and people either accept it or reject it. But a lot of people who had been raised in philosophical ways of thinking thought, no, we need to show how rationally the biblical faith can be integrated into what we believe about philosophy. And so the earliest philosophy applied to Christianity was Gnosticism, and it was disastrous for Christianity in the first few years, because Gnostic philosophy and biblical worldview are almost opposites in terms of their view of God, their view of the world, their view of human beings, their view of human life, human sexuality. And so if you put a philosophy together with a kind of an opposite view of the nature of reality, you're going to get quite a mess. And that mess continued to influence Christianity through the centuries, even though lots of theologians tried to clean it up a little bit. But then Platonism, particularly Neoplatonism, had a great effect on the way Christianity was explicated. And two of the chief people in this regard were Origen and Augustine. And Augustine had been had been three different things before he became a Christian. His mother was a Christian, but his father was a Roman pagan. And I'm not using the word pagan in a pejorative sense. I'm using it in the sense of a predominant religious perspective in the Roman Empire. Augustine's father was a pagan, his mother was a Christian, but Augustine didn't become a Christian until he was a grown man. He first kind of relished the virtues of paganism, but somehow or another, as a lot of people during that period, he kind of got the feeling that holiness somehow or another was the suppression of sexuality. And since he had a mistress and had a child by that mistress, he started feeling kind of guilty about it for some reason. Not because he was a Christian, because he wasn't a Christian. So he became a Manichae. And Manichaees are those that were the group of people who believed that sex was just totally, absolutely unholy. And that not only should you avoid it on holy occasions, but you should avoid it at all times, which is the reason why there's no First Manichae Church here in Houston. And the Manichaees had a tremendous impact on Augustine, but he finally realized how extreme this philosophy was in terms of human life, and that human life just didn't seem to thrive under this viewpoint. And so he turned to Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism was somewhat more positive about human life and human sexuality than Manichaeism, but it was still somewhat negative about these things. Plato said that the body is the prison for the soul. Well, that is not a biblical idea at all. And that implies that the body somehow is, that being in a body is somehow the fall. And the fall in the Bible is not being in a body. Being in a body is the creation in the Bible. So when you put a view together that says the body is the creation with the view that the body is the fall, then you're going to get quite a jumble. And that is what happened to Augustine to a certain extent, even though as he grew older, his theology became more consistent with the biblical view of the body and of human life and so forth. But when we read old characters like that, we read something that he wrote when he was 20 and read something he wrote when he was 50 and don't know that there's been a change. And so that's largely what happened to Augustine. He became more biblical as he grew older and as he moved farther away from Manichaeism and Neoplatonism. But the fact of the matter is that there was no human being between Paul and Thomas Aquinas who was more influential on intellectual thought in the West than Augustine. And so if he had a quirk like wanting to get rid of his mistress and live a celibate life, that had a tremendous effect on the history of Christianity. So much so that when I read some women's literature these days, they read Paul as if he were a Neoplatonist, because Augustine considered himself to be an interpreter of Paul. And so they'll read passages from Paul's writings that make him look like a woman hater and a person who doesn't want to have sex, and on and on. And you can do that to Paul if you read him as though he were a Neoplatonist or a Manichae. But if you read him as though he were a Jewish rabbi, which is what he was, then you get a little bit different reading. And I'll probably show that to you as we go along, because a study of the science in the Bible has a great deal to do with our understanding of what a human being is. And that's the reason why the word soul comes into this discussion as well. What is a human being? Okay, any other question as we go along? Any question from out at Fort Bend? Say something in your mic so we'll know you're there.
We're here, just me.
That's good enough. That's a fine audience. All right, are there any questions about the technicalities of the course then that we need to clarify? I think it's all found adequately described in your syllabus.
I have a question.
Okay.
Where you said that there's a correction on the syllabus that the tape broadcast dates are going to be on Sundays. What time? I mean, I'm sorry, on Saturdays. Saturdays are corrected.
Saturdays at 1 o'clock in the morning. Most of the students signed up for this course are signed up to watch the TV. And that TV broadcast will be on Saturday morning, 1 o'clock to 3:30. So they will not be in classes either here or in the satellites. So their way of doing the course will be somewhat different from the way you're doing it. But if you want to get a tape of the course and see your picture when you're in there, you can tape it on Saturday morning at 1 o'clock.
How many tests will there be?
The midterm exams, there'll be 2 of them, will be completed using the website. And they will be posted on the website for, I believe, a week. And you'll be notified when they're posted. And so you can enter the website at any point and click on when you're ready to take the exam. You need to be ready to take the exam because it is timed. So say if you have an hour and 30 minutes, as soon as you click it on, the time starts. And you can't click off and go back and study it again and do it. So anyway, those are and they're going to be objective exams. I've discovered over the years that even though this is a history of thought course, you can just as well make these into objective thought questions, which do get around to the subject. And so that's the way the exams will be given.
So we will not be taking the test during class?
Not these midterm. We're still working on what we're going to have to do for the final.
How will we get our homework assignments?
We'll get our homework assignments over the web page. And maybe you just ought to tell us something about that.
Well, you'll be getting an email.
Do your thing.
You'll be getting an email tomorrow with instructions on how to access the website, with your user ID to enter, your password, and then once you get in there, I'll have things set up so it'll be fairly self-explanatory. And if you want to find homework assignments, you go to the thing that says homework assignments, and if you're looking for the quizzes, you go to the thing that says quizzes, and it's really very simple. And if you ever have any questions, all you have to do is send me an email. You'll also have an email identity within the web so that you can send emails to each other. There will be a discussion board where if you get confused or lost or you have an idea, there's all sorts of aspects within the web program that will really facilitate when we come to class being able to be much more prepared and share ideas and not feel quite as lost, especially for the folks out in Fort Bend. And also the tape.
You've been listening to our honorable and noble assistant, as he likes to call himself, and he will, if you didn't hear that because of the sound problems, just if you're out there, you just need to understand that you need to get in contact with him. in order to get access to the website, and that is very important for this course. This is the first course I've ever taught in which the website has been important. And I am kind of a Luddite, which you need to look up in the dictionary, which means that, among other things, I thought that I would be able to die before I became expert on the computer, but it may not be so. But we do have a very good, what?
Luddite teaching a video course?
Yeah. It can be done, they tell me. But the result, I think, is going to be very. It's very surprising to me how well this can be done, and you probably will not want to take any other courses any other way after you do it this way. Any other questions?
Will there be banging next week?
Well, I hope there will not be banging next week. But since this course is taped, there will be banging for years to come. Okay, any other particular questions? Let me just say a couple of other things about Revelation. In the discussions that are going on now between people who are trying to prove God by science, and there are some brilliant young evangelical scientists who are trying to do that now, and they've put out all kinds of books. They're not proving that God exists, but what they're trying to prove or trying to show is that there is evidence for design in the universe. Well, those folks, scientists, especially Nobel Prize winners who are very unhappy with this intrusion into their area of expertise, are trying very hard to show that these people have no right in the scientific discussion. And I'm not going to decide for them whether they should have a right or not, but the two arguments that anti-theological scientists make, having to do with the relationship of nature to God, the two basic arguments turn out to be two of the oldest arguments. One is the argument about revelation. That is, from their perspective, with all of the brains and all of the knowledge and all of the insight they can muster, they cannot see any evidence that there is a revelation or evidence that there is a design by a supernatural or a transcendent being. That everything in nature can be explained totally in terms of natural processes. And another one of their arguments, which is also, that argument goes back long before the development of modern science. But another one, which goes back even farther, is the argument from the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. Darwin brought this up quite a bit in his writings against special creation. How can you believe in special creation if you have all of this incredible pain and suffering in this struggle that takes place in the development of human life and of the world? How can you taint the image of God with all of that suffering and so forth? And one of the things I'm going to be trying to do in this course is to make the point that these are not new arguments that have been put forth because of modern science. Theologians and philosophers have been dealing with them ever since the beginning of the discussion of God. And any theology has to include a theology of suffering. If it doesn't have a good theology of suffering, the most profound argument against the existence of a good God is the suffering of one baby. You don't have to have the suffering of millions of people, just the suffering of one baby. And so the suffering argument is a very important one for people who want to keep any talk of God out of scientific discussion. We're just going to have to look at that and see if that is enough of a thing to keep people from discussing these issues together. Because it's getting hot out there. It's getting hostile. There was a fight at Baylor University just a few months ago over whether people even ought to be discussing the possibility of science dealing with the question of God. And evolutionists are fighting over it. So it's a subject which is at hand. So if you're interested in continuing that discussion, we're here.